Okay, this is first of two presentations I'm going to make. This is my first run through. I'm sure I'll do this 50 times. But basically, this is called The World is So Fracked Presentation 2022 and How You Profit from Coming War. I'm going to outline why I claim war is coming, and it's going to be of the global world war variety because of the number of players involved, and I'll get to that. I'll describe Axis 2 versus Allies 2 and the two paths to war that I see that will force the hands of government. One is a COVID lawsuit, and the other is a fiscal disaster, or in other words, a trade lockout of China. And later on, I'm going to describe war calculus to you, why nations do the predictable thing over and over again when they're put in the situation that they're in. And more importantly, at the second half, I'm going to tell you how to profit from it. Okay, so right now, the world is bifurcating from the global world order dominated by Western countries into a two sphere of influence domain. So you have America, which is bigger than everyone else, and the nations of the West in general, including most European nations, India, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, okay, Vietnam. Believe it or not, Vietnam will get involved, and so will Myanmar. Obviously, you've got proxy war zone Ukraine on the side of the Americans. And then the new axis is Russia. China is the predominant ally in that alliance. Iran, Pakistan, and the one with the squiggly Arabic characters is Afghanistan. Afghanistan chose the Chinese over the Americans. They wanted a better deal. We'll see how well that goes. But the world order of 1945 is now crumbled, and there are reasons for it, and you will see these patterns every day emerging, and you will be scared when you listen to your government say things that governments in 1938 and 1905 said. So there are two big factors which draw nations towards war. In my understanding of geopolitics, the first one is one I described in another video called Clausewitzian escalations, which is you watch an enemy do something, you interpret it as threatening, then you counter threaten by doing something against them. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as both sides amp each other up. And the most important thing, and the reason why war is going to happen, and I'll explain that later, is debt. The world is awash in debt. We don't have positive assets. We have a bunch of borrowing of other people's positive assets. Okay, so what is a Clausewitzian escalation? Like I talk about, it's where a nation, the people, the consciousness, the zeitgeist, foreign policy starts to see threats in other nations towards that nation. Okay, I've put the link in here. It's in my videos. I don't have a lot of videos, so you won't miss it. But it explains using Clausewitz's own ideas how nations before before a war, in my corollary to Clausewitz, they force themselves down the path of war because they always act the same way for their own best interests. Okay, so there's lots of people escalating, and I've been warning for years, since 2020, when the Chinese Wuhan flu virus came out. It looked suspiciously like a bioweapon made for first strike. If you think about it, the Chinese would love to have a weapon that incapacitates all the Taiwanese defenders. Or let's say you take an airplane and load up bioweapon in it, fly it over Taiwan. It starts in, and you'd fly it over Taipei because that's a huge city. It's a mega city, and it would spread quickly amongst everyone, right? Because everyone goes into the same diner, and everyone goes to the same supermarkets. It would, okay, so imagine if you had a bioweapon that was aimed at Chinese DNA, either to kill them or it's susceptible to be infected by. You spread it over the Taiwanese population, and then when they have this plague, this outbreak, this health crisis, China can come across the strait, across the China Sea as a humanitarian mission and pull up their hospital ships beside their landing craft, unload 200,000 soldiers in Taipei, and we're here on a UN sanctioned mission, and then never leave. Okay, so the world is awash in debt. If you're an American, you've heard about the $35 trillion that the American government itself is in debt for, and that's a blisteringly large number for most people to understand. But Japan is at a huge loss as far as forward economic ability based on debt. And as you can see from this one, China is not far behind. Now, China is lying. Their numbers are way worse than this, and that's why war is coming, because they've lied to everyone. Okay. In this graph, which is a couple years old, because it only says $20 trillion, the U.S. holds a third, roughly, of all outstanding debt. At the same time, China was estimated at 7.9%. Now, you know, Sri Lanka is on this little part of the graph. Sri Lanka has fallen. It's a failed state. It had a sovereign debt crisis because of its borrowing. Okay, so just because a nation has a relatively small per capita debt, it doesn't mean that they aren't going to fall apart. It doesn't mean that lenders will stop lending to them. Japan, which is a major enemy of China, we in our modern 70 years don't know this, but Japan invaded Manchukuo, invaded Manchuria, which is a very large part of China, and the Chinese haven't forgotten that. Okay, that was World War II. Chinese fought against that, and then Mao Zedong and the Communist Revolution took over. But they haven't forgot Japan is the other side of the fence. And Japan may need to go to war for its own sake, and I'll get to that. India, 2.5%. Right, I mentioned Sri Lanka has failed. But Pakistan is not far behind. Okay? So it looks 2.5% for India and 0.3% for Pakistan. True, but Pakistan has 200 million people. India has 1 billion. So if you divide it up, it's still fairly steep. The European engines, the engines of the EU, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom are all debt crisis, sovereign debt crisis worry people. Now they're lucky inside the EU. They just borrow more imaginary money from each other, but they have reasons why they'd want to go to war with China so they could get their debt repaid as war reparations. So they could get things off their balance sheets. Okay, so the speed of debt in the U.S., the speed of the U.S. government borrowing and spending has increased to unsustainable levels and is predicted to be so bad by 2048 on the current path. And of course, Steve Bannon and his war room posse are trying to get Trump elected, but Trump spent money left, right, and center when he was in too. So I'm not convinced that Trump will put an end to ridiculous spending. Maybe the Congress will, who knows, but they're on a bad path as well as the Chinese. Okay, so these are the holders of U.S. debt. The important number to look at is China. China owns pardon me, almost 20%. This is a couple years old. Almost 20% of U.S. debt. So if you're the American government, wouldn't it be great if you could get China to write off $1 trillion or $2 trillion of assets? That would be a huge boon in 1 year to your balance sheet. Well, how are you going to make that happen? Simple. Go to war, make them sign a peace treaty. Okay, yeah. Unsustainable debt. The U.S. isn't the only one that's been doing this. Canada's now ridiculously fallen off this imaginary cliff as well. The UK has been run into the ground the same way. France, same thing. Germany, same thing. Okay, the governments need an out. And China, like I said, China's lying. They are the most indebted nation on earth. I don't believe for a minute that they haven't over borrowed everything that was given to them by Wall Street. Okay, their local government debt crisis is almost $8 trillion. This was in May. This news headline. Okay, so they are under huge pressure to get rid of their fiscal problems as well. Okay, so there's two paths to war, like I said, and I'm going to explain them in the next video. I am not alone in this prediction. I have been warning about this ever since I realized the Taiwan first strike potential of a Wuhan Institute of Virology bioweapon. It makes sense as a defense scientist who has pitched projects to governments. I could see some biologists saying, "Look, you want to strike Taiwan, and you don't want a lot of fuss and mess, and you don't want to destroy half of Taipei. Seed the clouds with a bioweapon. Most of them will be sick when you land. You'll mop up the defenders." I could see somebody promising that this would work. Okay, so I'm not the only one saying this, but the war is coming, and you have a chance to profit from it.